I don't care what your ticket says. The window seat is mine, and I want her fired immediately. Diane Monroe's high-pitched, harsh voice tore through the quiet air in the first-class cabin, stabbing coldly into every gaze that turned back. A middle-aged woman, a curvaceous figure in a tight Chanel dress, stood in the middle of the aisle, her hand pointed straight at the face of Kyla Mitchell. A 17-year-old black girl who sat still, her eyes calm, her hand still clutching her plane ticket. "I told you, ma'am, this is my chair," Kyla replied, her voice quiet but clear, trying to maintain respect even when insulted. Diane curled her lips, her eyes filled with disdain. "Do you think I care? Someone like you doesn't deserve to sit here. This is first class, not a place for lowlifes to barge in." Before the flight attendant could intervene, Diane leaned down, grabbed Kyla's chin, and squeezed, an action that made the girl flinch in pain. But Kyla didn't cry. She just turned her head to look out the window, where her reflection showed her face struggling to hold on to her last shreds of dignity. With her other hand, she texted, "Daddy, help me." Have you ever been discriminated against and wished someone would stand up for you? If so, share your story in the comments. And if you believe that everyone deserves respect, right, no injustice, with your country's flag, subscribe, because what follows is a dignified response, and you don't want to miss it. The seat is mine. I don't care what her ticket says. Someone like her doesn't belong up here. Diane Monroe's high-pitched, commanding voice was loud enough for everyone in the business class to hear. Heads turned, eyes curious, concerned, then surprised, as the middle-aged woman in the Chanel suit pointed straight at a young girl, 17-year-old Kyla Mitchell, sitting quietly in the window seat, still clutching her boarding pass, with her seat number boldly printed on it. 3A. "Ma'am, I have a valid ticket for this seat," Kyla replied softly, her voice steady but not hiding the tremor beneath her composure. She wasn't raising her voice. She wasn't fighting back. She was simply trying to stay true, as her father had taught her. Calm was a form of strength. But that seemed to make Diane even angrier. "People like you," Diane emphasized the last two words with contempt, "don't get to sit here. You think you're special? You're not. You're just lucky the system lets you on board." And then, the unexpected happened. Diane stepped forward, crouching down close to Kyla's face, and in an insolent gesture, she tugged at Kyla's cheeks as if inspecting a cheap item. The young woman's face crumpled, not just from the sting of the pulled skin, but from the shock and humiliation that surged hotly through her chest. Everything froze for a few seconds. A flight attendant at the front of the cabin gasped, but didn't have time to react. Kyla didn't cry. She sat still, her eyes fixed on the window, her face reflected back at her. A girl trying to hold on to her dignity in the midst of a blatant insult. Her silence wasn't out of weakness, but because she knew that if she spoke up at the wrong time, she would be blamed. She was used to judgmental looks and whispers behind her back, but never had she faced such a public and brutal insult. There was only one thing she knew she needed to do right now. She bowed her head slightly, hiding her phone under her coat, her fingers trembling, but quickly texting a short message to the only person in this world she believed could protect her. "Need you. Please come." On the other end, FBI agent David Mitchell's phone buzzed as he left a top-secret national security briefing. He looked at the text message, no details, no explanation, but those 3 words told him everything. His little girl was hurting. David Mitchell was on the 6th floor of the FBI headquarters in downtown Seattle when the phone in his pocket buzzed. He ducked his head, his eyes still clouded by the lingering scent of a long meeting, full of gunpowder and urgent intelligence briefings. But when he saw 3 words flash across the screen, "Need you? Please come," everything around him seemed to blur. He didn't ask why. He didn't need more details. He didn't need to know who did what. Because as a father who had taken his daughter to therapy after a year of bullying at school, who had sat with Kyla every night after a panic attack, he knew one thing. If Kyla had to cry out for help, it was no small thing. David walked out of the conference room as if he had been sucked into an invisible storm. But with every step, the cold, steady, and decisive look of a 20-year veteran agent was still evident on his face. An FBI agent could confront terrorists, federal criminals, But what made his heart clench the most were 3 words from his daughter. 15 minutes later, he was standing in the airport, behind the glass doors that separated him from the boarding area. The security guard, familiar with him, nodded without asking any questions and let him through. The plane hadn't taken off yet, and he saw the girl, sitting in row 3A. Her face was turned toward the window, her shoulders slightly hunched as if she were holding back a silent pain. And across the aisle he saw the blonde woman in the white suit talking to the flight attendant. Loud voice, pointing, expression that was unmistakably complaining. David said nothing to anyone. He walked straight into the business class cabin, his stride calm but heavy as thunder. He stopped right in front of Diane Monroe. "Excuse me, are you the one who just touched my daughter?" His voice was low, not loud, not hurried, but there was something in the tone that made everyone around him fall silent. Diane took a step back. Maybe it was because he was taller, or because the FBI badge on his jacket pocket was starting to tell her that this wasn't as simple as she thought. She opened her mouth to retort, but David held up a hand gently, as if to say no. Not because he was afraid of what she was going to say, but because he wasn't going to give her another second to create chaos. "I don't care what your problem is with seat numbers or whatever story you've made up," he said slowly, his eyes never leaving Diane. "But when you lay a hand on my child, you crossed a line you should never have." In that moment, all the arrogance drained from Diane's face. It was as if she had just realized she had stumbled upon something she had not been sufficiently knowledgeable to anticipate. And for the first time, she was silent. Diane said nothing more. The way she pulled her hand back, slowly but shakily, was like someone being pulled out of a dream she thought she was in control of. Her gaze was still fixed on David, but there was no defiance or arrogance in it. It was something else, a belated realization, as if she had finally understood that there were lines no one was allowed to cross, and today she had crossed them with pride. With no one to support her, no one to laugh with, Diane stood alone in the silence of the business class, where the air had been as tense as a bowstring a moment before. Now there was only the sound of each person's heart pounding in their chest. Kyla remained seated, but her back was no longer arched as she had been in the initial attempt to deflect the insult. Though her eyes were still moist, she took a deep breath, as if to use the air to push out a long-suppressed feeling in her chest. She turned to look at her father, no words needed, for his gentle, steady gaze spoke for her. In that moment, amid the many curious gazes, Kyla no longer felt small. She felt seen, defended, protected, and most of all taught to hold her pride without raising her voice. David Mitchell stood there, not threatening, not imposing, but not giving in. He knew that true power lay not in the display of power, but in the calmness that made others look at themselves. And the way Diane turned away, avoiding his gaze, was an acknowledgement, not in a fight, not in a clear victory, but in the timely presence of a father who devoted his heart to his daughter. In that business class cabin, as Diane stepped back and everyone began to return to their seats, something changed. Not just the silence that follows a confrontation, but a real silence. A new space where justice was no longer a distant concept, but something people had just witnessed. And for Kyla, for the first time in her life, she felt the peace that came from courage, not her own, but the love of a father who stood up for her when she needed it most. The flight continued in silence, but it was no longer the suffocating tension as before, but a silence deep enough for people to start thinking about what had just happened. When the flight attendant announced that they were about to land, David stood up, gently leaned towards his daughter, and whispered a few short words, just enough to make her smile and nod. They left the business class with many people watching them, not out of curiosity, but out of respect for the two people who had walked through the storm without letting the wind blow away their dignity. On the way home from the airport, David and Kyla sat next to each other in the car like every other time, but this time, the space carried a different depth. The streetlights slid across the windshield, reflecting emotions that had yet to be named. Kyla was silent for a long time, then asked softly, "Weren't you angry?" David didn't answer right away. He looked forward, his hands still gripping the steering wheel, but his voice was as light as the night mist. angry. But I've learned that true justice isn't about revenge. It's about making others realize their mistakes through consequences they didn't foresee. Kyla said nothing more, but something was planted in her heart, not resentment or a thirst for revenge, but a simmering belief that in a world so fractured, a father's calm, wisdom, and kindness could mend the cracks that even power could not reach. For Diane, a woman who had always thought she was above everyone else, the moment of retreat was more than a personal failure. As the plane landed, and word of the incident began to spread within the airline, she couldn't help but think of her husband, a high-ranking airline executive, and what would happen if her actions were exposed. For the first time in years, Diane felt fear, not because she had lost face, but because she finally understood that lack of control, pride, and prejudice could not only hurt others, but also destroy what you hold dear. The impulsive act was now more than just a moment of anger. It was a question mark hanging over the honor of an entire family. And perhaps that night, in some small corner of her soul, Diane also began her own journey, a slow but necessary journey, to relearn how to be human, from the silence she once despised. A week after the flight incident, without the sound of announcements or judgmental eyes, Kyla and David stood on top of an ancient sand dune, overlooking the time-worn roofs of a small village on the Mediterranean coast. The vacation that seemed to have been canceled with their wounded pride now opened up like a quiet sky, where father and daughter found each other again, not through short text messages or curfew reminders, but through a simple and steady presence. The way David had been there when Kyla needed him most. They walked through the olive-lined streets, silently reading the faded inscriptions on the ancient stones, listening to the sound of the waves like a steady breath, ancient, more patient than any human anger. In the quiet twilights, Kyla began to understand that wounds need not leave scars if we know how to put forgiveness into them, not for others, but for ourselves, so as not to live forever in the shadow of hurt. That evening, amid the chirping of insects and the soft glow of a small lantern hanging on the porch, Kyla poured her father a cup of hot tea and sat down beside him, her eyes hesitant, but her voice filled with genuine curiosity. "Do you think people like Diane can change?" David did not answer right away. He took a sip of tea, put down the cup, and looked at his daughter, not with the eyes of an FBI agent who had faced hundreds of liars, but with the eyes of a father who understood that some answers must be told over a lifetime. No one is born with hate, but change takes courage, and sometimes it takes a moment deep enough to realize you were wrong. If you are lucky, that moment comes soon. If not, you have to learn to let go so that your soul is not bound by something that others cannot overcome. Kyla was silent, but the resentment inside her seemed to fall away with each word her father spoke, like the wind blowing away dust from an ancient stone slab at the end of the day, revealing something more enduring: compassion and a quiet belief that kindness is not a weakness, but a strong choice in a conflicted world. That night, in the small wooden room nestled among the trees, Kyla slept peacefully. And David, he sat for a while longer, watching the moonlight through the window, and he knew there were battles he had won without a threat or a gun in his hand. Because sometimes, the greatest thing a father can do for his daughter is teach her to stand firm, with a heart free of hatred.